we found it's very difficult to regularly attend meetings with the local authority, which we have to do because that's part of the way that our grant requires us to work, and to try to work co-productively and to simultaneously raise concerns from the parent community.
Yeah.
Because actually you're trying to straddle a line between being a critical friend and being critical, in our case, was unfortunately seen as critical rather than trying to be a critical friend. And we have been incredibly constructive. I really think we have a lot of evidence that we've done a lot of work to be constructive. But in the end, the LA, I think, has all the power in the relationship between parent care forums and the local authority.
Yeah.
So we're in the meetings by their invitation. If you take a stance that's not seen as constructive, then they can choose not to invite you to meetings. They can choose to withhold information so you don't actually know what's being discussed. And actually, in our case, ultimately, they can decide that they don't want to approve your funding. And we were very surprised that they were able to do that, but that happened to us. And so that makes it very difficult. You have to be extremely, I'm trying to say, confident to actually step into those meetings. And if everything's going well, then it's nice to, have that opportunity to shape policy. But I would say that things are not going well at the moment. And so we found ourselves having to take really difficult messages to our local authority, and I don't think they've thanked us for it. And actually, but the thing that makes us the most sad is that everything we've been feeding back to them for the last 3 years has been just recently confirmed in an Ofsted report. So, we weren't telling them anything, and we did bring a lot of evidence. We collected an issue log. It was all objective. It was fact-based. And I understand it's hard for them to hear things are not going well, but actually, if you can't get beyond you're being too critical, I don't think the relationship works productively. And if I can just take that one step, where we actually voted to close the charity, it wasn't about funding, it was actually because we're very concerned that if you can't get a productive relationship, a parent care forum just becomes something that legitimises decisions that perhaps are not in the interests of parents, because the local authority can say, but we've spoken to the parent care forum. The parent care forum may have said something that goes completely against what the policy is, but they use that badge sometimes, at least our local authority has, to say parents have been consulted, and actually that is not correct. So that, I think, is the complex dynamic with parent care forums. I think everybody sincerely wanted to do the right thing, but it is very hard to walk that line. And ultimately, I do think that there's a problem that we don't actually have any power except to be influential and be nice and,
Okay. And Beth? And I'll just...
I think that with funding, you need to be able to show that you can challenge the local authority, and you have to be very careful about how you manage which parents go into meetings. There is this feeling that if you have a parent who's very emotional, who's going to be upset at the local authority, it's going to damage our relationship. So we spent quite a long time trying to build this relationship with the local authority. In Hampshire, we have got a good working relationship, but it's that need to constantly maintain it. And if you're trying to manage which parents are going into meetings, the really important messages aren't getting through, because the parents that they need to hear from are the ones that have been let down, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to see where there are gaps in your provision. But in terms of funding, I think there are some parents that have a distrust of parent carer forums because of that, and we have to constantly prove that that's the case. But I think within parent carer forums, having peer-to-peer support, having that sort of framework is very, very powerful, and having a parent carer forum funded means that we can do, in Hampshire, we've got Futures in Mind programmes, we've got Talk Together programmes, we've got Get Together programmes, Learn Together programmes, and we also have a regular Meet the SEND team, which means that we can bring the local authority and parents directly together, and that can be quite challenging at times, but the local authority is very keen to do those. They recognise that it improves communication, and that helps them do their job.
Is it fun? Do you think you've got enough funding to? Is there a sufficient funding, or is it actually about where the funding comes from? Do you think that should be more independent? Which is it?
I think parent care forums do a huge range of work across the country, and no parent care forum is the same across the country, because they represent their local communities where we're drawn, and what works in Tower Hamlets won't work in Norfolk, and so they're very different. So But depending on what local need is, some forms are well funded, others are hardly supported at all by their local authority. And just if I could just build on something that there was a survey of parent care reforms done each year. The last one was in November 2017, and in that survey, 69% of parent care reforms felt they had a good, productive relationship with their local authority. Which you flip that round, and there's roughly a third that are saying that they don't, that they're not at the table in the way that they should be, they're not being listened to. So that in itself tells you that 4 years in, we've still got a hell of a way to go.
Can I just say something else about the funding? So we didn't take any funding from the local authority at all. All our funding came through the grant, which is administered by Contact and ultimately comes from the Department for Education. But it has to be signed off by somebody in the local authority who says they're prepared to work with you as the Parent Carer Forum. So even though it's not local authority money, and I think the problem with that for us was that gives the local authority the sense that they can choose the Parent Carer Forum, which I don't think is the intention at all, but it certainly gives that impression. And we did push that, and we did push it all the way up to the Department for Education. And we were told, no, that's the way it is. The local authority ultimately has to decide if they want to work with you. And that, I feel, further imbalances the relationship between what is basically a group of very busy, very under-the-cosh parents who are volunteering and an organisation which is paid from taxes to look after our children. It doesn't send the right message, I think.
How would you improve that then?
I think there needs to be somebody who can sit above the local authority and say, actually, unless your PCF is completely useless or doing something which is wrong, then you have to work with them. I think that didn't happen in our case. We did try to escalate it through Contact, but we were ultimately told if the local authority won't sign off, then you can't have the money. And I don't want to make it about the money, because actually that's a symptom of the relationship.
Yeah, of course.
But I think it's unhelpful that authority is there, because it gives the impression that we work for the local authority, which we were very clear we do not and should not. We always were there for the parents. Can I talk a bit about co-production? Because that's obviously what parent care reforms ultimately are set up to do. And I think in our closing statement wrote that we didn't think it was possible in the current climate. Could I just expand on that? So the first problem is the degree to which unlawful practice has become embedded within the way that local authorities operate because of the need to ration what's handed out. And we have a lot of evidence of the local authority not following the code of practice, and the Ofsted report confirmed that. So our conversation has become increasingly about trying to hold the local authority to account to actually implement the code of practice lawfully. Mm-hmm. That surely isn't something that parent carer forums should be having to do, but that seems to have fallen to us to do that. That's not a good basis for a co-productive relationship. And I don't know where else in the system anybody, apart from the voluntary sector and parents, are holding the system to account, except Ofsted, and they come around every 3-4 years. That's the first problem. Second problem...
Just to be concise, if you can.
Yes.
Because of time,
so,
thanks.
Co-production of cuts. The agenda in our local authority is unremittingly about cuts. Right. I mean, massive cuts. How can you ask parent carers to co-produce massive cuts to services? It makes no sense. The third point is legal knowledge. You actually need to know a lot about the law to be working in a co-productive environment, and the Parent Carer Network doesn't really provide that. So you can find yourself in a consultation where you're actually agreeing to things that are not in the interests of, because you're not totally clear about the law. Mm. And then the final point is that we bumped into a situation where there was a complete refusal to acknowledge the problems in the system. We had to be seen to be keeping the ship going. If you can't acknowledge the problems in the system, you can't fix the problems in the system. And I think we've bumped up against that for years in our local authority and kept saying, no, it's not right, but we weren't listened to. And you can't work co-productively if you can't agree on the problem.
You're saying it's a great idea, but not working in practice.
It didn't work for us at all.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And are you aware of anything being done strategically across the board? Is the DFE doing anything to try and improve things on that?
Do you know, in the current funding climate, I'm not optimistic, because I think a lot of this antagonistic behaviour comes from the local authority being caught between the law, which says it's a needs-based system, and the funding, which is a ration system. And I don't know how you can have a co-productive conversation where we're all in that strange vice.
Sorry, Beth.
Yeah, I was just saying that with parent care reformers, you've got to also think about whether you're just a voice or whether you're actually involved with decision making, and what co-production is being looked at. If you're just invited to go to a forum, that isn't really co-production. That's just allowing you to have a parent voice within that. But if you are allowed to start right at the beginning of something, in Hampshire we've done the HC hub, that we have been right at the beginning saying what it needs to look like, but it's not across the board. And we've also had to pull back from getting involved with consultations, because we do a huge amount of work with parents to put our voices forward for consultations, and then all of the consultations go through because that's how much money they need to save. So we've had the short breaks funding cuts, we've had the homeschool transport cuts, and it's all happened despite what parents have said, and all the work that we've done to get those voices in has still gone through. So we have to balance what we're doing with the local authority with what we're saying to parents, because if parents lose trust in what we're doing, then we don't have a voice to give to you.
One of the things that we struggled with our local authority was to try to get them to implement the code of practice correctly, so that the thresholds for doing a needs assessment, the way that needs assessment was done in a consistent and high quality way, and that still hasn't happened. If that were in place, then the system should pick up people who come into it and assess based on need. I think the difficulty has come is that even though I think the guidelines are quite, and we wrote a whole bunch of guidelines for people around it, if they're not followed, then only the strong who can fight and say, no, I know the code of practice and I know you can't reject my request based on this, can get through the gate.
Yeah, and the final question is do you think that there should be, and it was mentioned in the previous session, a national framework or some kind of contract or template that was sent to or given to every parent who had a child with special educational needs, to so that they know what their rights are, how the system works, and what they can do. And that obviously that's not the only thing, but that could be an important start.
I think if that was in an accessible form, the problem that's happened, because we've spent a lot of time doing documentation and trying to bring systemic change that way, and I'm sure other local authorities have done the same. The problem is the poor practice trumps that. So we've written down guidelines, but if you then phone your caseworker and you're told something different, so it's actually adherence to the code of practice would be the first thing I'd be looking to try to improve. Because if the local authority had the funding and the will to adhere to the code of practice, then I don't think as many of these fights would have to happen.
I think that
should be a national code of practice.
Yeah,
it is a national code of practice.
Not
no one knows about it. That's the problem.
Yeah.